fighting woman. See, Midas Waklam, I'm the daughter of the CAHVE man. And I'd like to welcome you here, welcome you into the Snohomish tribal territory. This county was named after the first people of this land, and that is who I am from. And so we come tonight to say you're welcome to be here. We welcome you. We're glad to host you here. These are really important issues, this forum tonight. So as we go on and progress with the evening, I want to put a word into your ears and into your heart, into your hutch, into your hachusida, the intelligence of your mind, which is here. No cognitive dissonance can live here, relatives. And the word is yahau. 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 It means to push forward together. And it means more intimately, it means it can only be completed together. It can only be completed together. So anything in this world, in this life, in the third dimension, if there's anything to be accomplished, we must learn how to do it together. So welcome to the evening. All of you, all the way in the back, all the way out, still outside, all of you, anybody behind me, anybody to my left and my right, be welcome to be here. Be happy. Dahadukshu.
Thank you so much. And now with the land acknowledgement, we're going to have Reverend Paul Benz, but let me tell you a little bit about Reverend Paul Benz. He's the co-director of the Faith Action Network, and he is an ordained minister of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He served as the director of the Lutheran Public Policy Office of Washington previous to his role at the Faith Action Network. Paul has been a longtime social justice leader in Washington State's religious community on numerous issues, and he continues to advocate for FAN's legislative agenda in Olympia. He is the lead organizer for FAN's growing network of advocating faith communities, which have pledged to partner with FAN to be advocates in the halls of power. And now, let's have a warm welcome for Reverend Paul Benz.
Tonight, as we begin our program, I'd like to bring this. We acknowledge whose land we are on, and oftentimes we as urban and suburban people seldom interact with land. But it is the First Nations peoples that we want to acknowledge and remember tonight, particularly those First Nations peoples whose land we live on here in the place called Snohomish County. Peoples who are too often forgotten, too often missing, too often murdered. We remember particularly their tribal names tonight: the Tulalip, the Snohomish, the Stillaguamish, the Skykomish, and the Sauk-Suatal tribes. I urge each of us tonight to, and tomorrow and the days ahead of our lives, to learn more and get engaged with our First Nations neighbors whose land we live on. But tonight I also want to take a minute to acknowledge and remember the land that we live on is stolen land, land that was taken unjustly, where white privilege and white Christian nationalism played a very important role, a fundamental basis of this historic injustice that was oftentimes called manifest destiny, that has not only legal roots, but Christian religious roots. And the point person for all of this was a man by the name of, in the 1850s, was Isaac Stevens, our territorial governor, who, in my opinion, unfortunately, his framed photo and picture is in the governor's office, because he was point in his support staff on treaties like that was signed here locally in this county, Point Elliott and Point No Point. And when Native leaders like Chief Leschi resisted, it became Isaac Stevens' personal agenda to see that Chief Leschi would live no longer, hung in the gallows in Steilacoom. I, as a white man, am complicit in that unjust system that leaves out historic treaty tribes like the Snohomish and like the Duwamish. As we listen and learn here tonight more about white supremacy, may we not forget its impact on all of us, and particularly our First Nations neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Paul. Next up, we have Snohomish County Executive Dave Summers. Dave Summers took office as the 5th Snohomish County Executive on January 1st, 2016, having served previously on the Snohomish County Council. Dave is focused on developing policies to make our communities safer, healthier, more sustainable, and more prosperous. He has spent his career in public service working for fiscal accountability and being a responsible steward of the public's resources. Let's have a warm welcome for Snohomish County Executive Dave Summers.
Thank you, Kevin, and I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. This is so important that we come together, and we've already heard the importance of working together, being together, and moving forward together. But special thanks to Unidos, Communities Against Hate and Violent Extremism, and the ACLU, and all the sponsors that are listed on the back of your program. There's a lot of organizations that are doing this work each and every day. It's hard work, and we just should be really grateful to all those organizations and all the people that make them up for doing this on our behalf and everybody's behalf. And I want to thank the panelists also for sharing your experiences and thoughts and wisdom tonight. I'm very much looking forward to this. You know, it's easy these days, and I am both encouraged and discouraged when I listen to the news. There's so much hate and violence going on in not only our county, but the country and the world. It's easy to get discouraged, but I also see time and time again people coming together to put aside differences and work together to battle that hate and violence. At the end of the day, the one thing I've learned is the only thing you can combat hate with is love, and the thing you can combat fear with is hope, and ultimately battle darkness with light. And together we are stronger, better, more hopeful, and we need each other, and there's many, many people that need us. And we should also not forget that there's people in our county and country and world that thrive on chaos. And it's not a mistake that it seems like the whole world is stirred up these days, because those folks that want to sow division and hatred by creating fear of others, fear of anything that's different, sowing that fear and hate is what they want. And the only way we combat that is coming back at them with love and peace in our hearts, and coming back together stronger and stronger. So I want to thank again all of you for being here tonight. Let's strive to make Snohomish County a place where we truly do have liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up, we have two community panelists who are going to spend maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7, maybe 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes talking about their own personal perspectives on this event, but also just what's been happening in the region and just kind of share their lens, their personal lens about this. But I wanted to introduce them. Jennifer Bereskin-SeaMonster has been a community advocate for housing justice, dismantling childhood poverty. This work is elevated through local and statewide policy reform for human rights and social justice issues. Jennifer joined, we call it CAHVE, C-A-V-H-E, Communities Against Violent Hate and Extremism, almost 2 years ago to support the grassroots efforts to address domestic violence extremism in Snohomish County. And without further ado, Jennifer Bereskin-SeaMonster.
We at Jennifer Sista, Stahopsted, the Nanagachted, Sitbada Swaklam, to greet, say hello, my name is Jennifer. I am the youngest daughter of the Sea Monster Man, and I am Snohomish and Unanagak Aliut. And I had been mulling over everything that I was thinking about telling you today because I carry in my bones this 500 years of this. 500 years when we started with the doctrine of discovery. That was the beginning of what we now know is today. When I think about my ancestors who fought to ensure that I would be standing here today, it makes me want to help educate people to understand that what we have to do is, like my sister said, is to yahout. We really have to work together. The doctrine of discovery gave the legal foundation and set the policies for the genocide of my people. It's really hard. It's a really hard topic. I know this is something that we don't want to allow fear to take over. You know, we outnumber these things and the type of, how do I want to say, I think about our children and our people going forward, 7 generations forward, and to be in the communities that are impacted, and to know that we need to build up our allyship. We need to, and that's in all forms, right? It's because what impacts my community or any of the other communities here that are going to be speaking will impact your community. What happens to my child or my grandchildren will happen to your children and grandchildren. We have to understand of looking at the beginning, which was, like I said, the doctrine of discovery, and then the formation of manifest destiny, and the policies that were designed to ensure the genocide of the indigenous people of the Americas. Each and every one of you has the ability and the power for change, regardless of who your ancestors were and how they came here. I encourage you, though, to learn about who your ancestors were, learn about your cultural identity and your connections. I feel like when you're dealing with hate and division, I'm looking at America, and America's cultural identity has been built upon the killing of our indigenous people, the reaping of our lands, the enslavement of people in the Black community, the taking away of the abuse of labor for our immigrant communities. We have a lot to atone for. We have a lot to acknowledge. And when I think about hate and racism and discrimination, I think of it as a tree. And when you're talking about really digging deep into the core issues, You have to dig into the roots. Otherwise, you're just going to be raking up the leaves and trimming the branches, and it's just going to keep growing. But unless you get down deep, deep into the roots of the issues and acknowledge not one single treaty was ever honored, not one. So looking at what can you do as American citizens in the richest country in the world, we have power. Each and every one has a responsibility. I want you guys to remember that, because as I stand here, you know, this is really hard to come out here and talk like this, because me as an Indigenous woman, I could go missing or murdered, and there's no telling if you'd find me, because that is the reality here. We have to really dig into these issues, and we have to do it together. And every person, even if you're scared, you still have to move forward. My ancestors died so that I could live. And the least I can do is at least honor their sacrifice and be able to best serve my community and try to serve the children and the people that come after me. When we're talking about these issues, it's really hard because, you know, Western society, you guys really hone in on guilt and shame. And it's okay if you don't get it right the first time. In our community, we keep doing it until we get it right, and that's okay. But I think there's something about the culture as a whole that you guys don't give yourselves a little grace and realize that you can keep trying even if you don't get it right. You can ask the hard questions. You know, for us, at least in my community, if you wanted to ask me a question, I wouldn't be offended, because my elders would tell me, if you don't have any questions, then you assume you know it all. You can't know it all. If you did know it all, you wouldn't need each other. So asking questions and learning from each other and learning of their perspectives, learning of their histories, and what it is that we can do to Yahout, to build a strong, healthy, thriving community. You know, something they don't tell you in the history books here about the formation of Washington was that they used to burn down our longhouses with our people still in them. They would wait till our men were gone. And those longhouses had elders and women and children. And then those that were trying to escape the fire, they would shoot them. You know, these are the hard truths, and understanding that despite the current system that was built to kill me, I still want to change it. I still want to build a community. I still want to make it better, because each and every person has the ability to do that. That's why we're in America, the United States of America, right? We have that kind of power. So I'm asking you guys to no longer be passive, no longer don't be complacent. Silent is consent. You know, even if it's only one thing that you can do to help, whether that's learning from the organizations that helped co-sponsor, or figuring out how you can better know your neighbor, or if there's a community that you're not familiar with, let's figure out how you can get to know each other, how you can to break down those biases and those fears that you may have, or those unknowns. I think it's important. You know, when you think about, when I go outside and I see all these little ones playing, they're not worried about the unknown. They just want to get to know someone, make a friend. And these are really hard topics, and it's about time. It's about time. My people are dying. We are dying. And you guys have the ability to help stop it. Every single person. And I know you guys can do it, because I'm talking to your hutch, to your hachusara, to the intelligence of your mind. And so as we go forward tonight, and you go home, and you're laying down and you're thinking, just know that you guys are strong. We are stronger than anything that could try to tear us apart. Now, I just want to say that I really appreciate every single one of you coming out here. I know there's a lot of other things you could have been doing tonight, and I really do appreciate you. And I really hope that we can work together to make the best change going forward. I know our history and our current relations have been strained, but let's build a better relationship. Let's build a better future. And just know that, we have to do this for our kids, for our grandbabies. There's nobody else that can do it for them. So let's do it together. Just wait, that's all.
Thank you very much. Very insightful words. Next up, we have some comments and perspective from Michael Adams from Change the Narrative. Michael Adams is the Executive Director of Change the Narrative Granite Falls. As a scholar and former corrections officer, Michael recognized the harmful inequities of the criminal legal system and committed himself to the transformational work of anti-racism and inclusion. After the murder of George Floyd, he founded Change the Narrative Granite Falls, a nonprofit based in rural Snohomish County, whose mission is to encourage anti-racism, ensure equity in policy and practice, support the community efforts in diversity and inclusion, and expand local resources to limit barriers to success. Let's have a warm welcome for Michael Adams.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I had something that I thought I wanted to say tonight, but as I sat here and listened to Jennifer, I just started hearing some of the same words come to my mind about our senses, touch and smell and taste and sight and hearing. And I started to think about what white supremacy wants us all to focus on, and how white supremacy focuses on stripping us down by our color and taking our culture away, wanting to limit our taste, wanting to take away our language, wanting to take away our history. And so I just want to ask everyone to close their eyes for a moment. Close your eyes, think back to childhood, think back to what you would see when you look through a kaleidoscope. How you sit there and you look in a kaleidoscope and you see so many different colors, so many different shapes that are in there. You're focusing in on those things that you see. And how there's beauty in what you see. You may pick out a specific color that sticks to you. You look for your favorite color, you see your favorite shape. But also the beauty in pulling back from that and seeing what is in that kaleidoscope as a whole. As you open your eyes, take a look around this room and look at the various people that are here, look at the diversity that's here, look at how we're all together because we want to hear and talk about this topic, and we have this shared mindset of wanting to get rid of white supremacy. What I think about as I think about America, and I think about how people who downplay white supremacy like to refer to America as a melting pot, how they like to say that I don't see color. I like gumbo, and as a kid, I loved to have the taste of seafood within the gumbo, but I didn't like the texture of some of the aspects like shrimp and crab. I was too lazy to want to try and learn how to crack crab on my own. But I think about, like, as you put those ingredients together and you can take something out and it has one flavor profile, and you put something in and it has another profile. And that's the beauty of diversity. That's the beauty of the work that we all do together as a collective to fight against white supremacy, is that when we work together and we come together from different cultures to be a strength and unified unit, there's more power in what we do in that fight. So I was thinking about the circle of influence and how we all can influence people throughout our lives. But I don't know if that circle analogy works best in the way that I think about it when we look at how we're gonna fight white supremacy. I'd like us all to face our fears and think about a spider web. And how you have those circles within a spider web, but you also have those connectors to those circles in that spider web. And what's happening on one side strengthens what happens on the other side. And we all see how when we go to take down a spider web, take off one attachment, and the rest of it becomes weaker. So as we all sit here and we think about working together, we think about the action that we can take against white supremacy. It's about strengthening one another, and it's about finding the side of the web that you may not be on, you may not be familiar with, and making sure that it's doing okay. White supremacy wants us to be divided. It wants us to be unseasoned. It wants us to not know what the other side is doing. So if we're communicating with one another, if we're checking in on each other, we're supporting one another, we're uplifting one another, that web is going to be strong. So I challenge you to walk across the web, face your fear, speak out, take action, stand up and support one another, and do the things that are needed to continue to eradicate white supremacy. I grew up in Eastern Washington. My grandmother chose to move to Moses Lake without having actually visited Moses Lake. Thought she was moving closer to Seattle. Yeah, my mom, she told me the story of when she first got to Moses Lake. She saw no black faces for the first few days that she was there, and all she did was cry. She grew up in LA, so moving from South Central LA to Moses Lake, a big culture change. But I remember growing up and being in Eastern Washington, and I would always love to come to Seattle. I'd love to go to California to visit family. I'd love to go places to see more diversity. And I had it in my mind that if I was around more diversity, I would somehow not experience racism. That I experienced racism because of the lack of diversity. I was aware of white supremacy because I was surrounded by white people. I moved to Snohomish County, and in recent years, I have been called the N-word more than throughout my entire childhood in Eastern Washington. I've heard more and more stories recently with how our social climate has been of youth experiencing hatred and having to experience that as well. My 11-year-old daughter is here in the crowd as well, and my kids have experienced things here. And so what I think about is looking 7 generations ahead, and what's the vision that we all want to have? You know, when we look through that kaleidoscope, what do we want to see for our culture, for our country? How do we want to see everyone coming together? You know, I think back to Dr. Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech and his vision that he had. And we speak about people being together and races being intermixed, and we think about that stuff. But what does it really mean if we don't have intention behind it? If we're just sitting in a room because the law says that we can all sit together, if we're not actually building relationships, if we're not actually celebrating one another's culture, it doesn't mean anything. So that was all off the top of my head, so I apologize if it didn't make sense. But you know, I really do want you all to leave this room thinking about the feeling that you get when you think about hearing the tragedies of the history of America, when you hear about lived experiences, the feeling that you get, that negative feeling, that isn't the purpose of why we share these things. We don't want you to be filled with pain and pity. We don't want to have to relive these experiences and talk about them because we want everyone to be sad. We want change. We want these emotions to turn into joy and happiness and togetherness. We want solidarity. White supremacy does not allow for that to happen. But we have the power to stop that by coming together to fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists. Wonderful job. And we are moving right along, and we are about to get to our featured speaker, and Juan Peralez will introduce our speaker. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about Juan. Juan was born in Texas. His parents were farm workers who came to Washington in 1059 when he was 11 years old. Now that's what the script says, 1059. So I always said, Juan, for your age, you look great. He graduated from Stanwood High School and got his degree in political science from the University of Washington. He started his political advocacy at the university as president of MECHA, M-E-C-H-A, the Chicano Student Organization, on campus in 1976. Juan Peralez was elected president of Unidos back in 1991. Unidos was created as a coalition of several advocacy organizations in Seattle. It's an ally of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. In this year's legislative session, Unidos lobbied legislators on bills supporting police accountability and a statewide commission to address white supremacy. Let's have a warm welcome for Juan Peralez.
Well, since I'm 75 years old, I have to write things down so I don't forget, okay? And I'm going to yell. No, thank you, first of all, for being here tonight. I've been dealing with police accountability like, Kevin was saying, and the last 3 years with my friend Luis Moscoso, we started talking about how can we work together to address white supremacy. So we've been talking about this for at least 3 years now, okay? And the Reverend Paul Benz was one of those, and Bill Ramos, and our country executive. We've been talking about this for a while now. So it's time that, we change what's going on in this country in terms of how people I'm sorry, I could have gotten on talking, I'm going to stop, but I do the introduction, okay? Now, if you notice Unidos, it says uniting law enforcement and communities. I used to be in the face of law enforcement all the time, demanding stuff, but I've made a decision that for 30 years I've been doing this. And so I've made a decision that unless we work with police in the inside, they want the change that is needed, it ain't gonna happen by us just putting pressure on people or police. So to me, when I started Unidos, it used to be called Juntos Podemos Ganar, which is what we've been talking about here, is unity, okay? Because we do have to come together to be able to change the things that we don't like white supremacy. So now I'll get into my introduction, okay? Thank you. Good evening, like I said, and thank you for being here. Tonight's keynote speaker is not new to Snohomish County. He was here in 2018 at the Everett auditorium, and it was overfilled that I had to stand all night. I think my friend Moscoso was standing as well. It packed over 200 people there. But as I'm looking out here, we almost have as many people here tonight. I was expecting more, but that's it. Anyway, In the late Peter Jackson, son of former Senator Scoop Jackson, and Luis Moscoso were instrumental in having our keynote speaker then, and then Luis was also instrumental in having him here tonight. He put me in contact with David. We spoke about what we're trying to do, and he said, I'll be glad to be there and participate. You know, we need to do this. Also, while he was here back then, in 2012, he wrote an op-ed, okay, that was published by the Everett Herald. And in that op-ed, he was talking about the young 9-year-old Briseña Flores that was murdered in Aravica, Arizona. She was murdered along with her father, okay? The guys came in and shot them both. The only reason they didn't shoot the rest of the family is because they weren't home. And the title of the op-ed that he wrote is A Crime That Could Have Been Prevented. Okay? He commended the County Executive's Office and the Human Rights Commission for supporting a vigil that was organized by Luis Moscoso. And, you know, at that time, we had a rally by the Minuteman militia, and Luis organized a protest of that rally. And the Minuteman militia are basically anti-immigrant people. They're the ones that go to the Mexican border hunting Mexicans, okay? In this case, it's a little different, but Shauna Ford, you know, was basically being investigated by police, but they didn't do a very good job. In 2008, she attempted to murder a friend that I used to work with at City Light, and his name was John Ford. Now, Shauna Ford, you know, was involved with the Minuteman militia, so her husband said, look, if you don't stop doing that activity that you're doing, I'm gonna file for divorce, which he did, and shortly after that, she calls him one day, John, are you gonna be home? Yeah, I'll be home. 2 hours later, somebody came into the back of the house and shot him 5 times. Okay, now, doctors didn't believe that he survived. How could he survive being shot 5 times? And when I was working with him, I noticed that he was gone for quite a while, and but he never spoke about it. But so anyway, Shauna Ford believed that the prime suspect, or should have been the prime. In Arizona, when our keynote speaker, David, was interviewing people and covering the trial of Shauna Ford because of her attempted murder of her husband, and he wrote a book that was called And Hell Followed With Her, Crossing the Dark Side of the American Border. Similar questions, you know, were asked of the investigation of a young Muslim man, 18-year-old, that was that was hung in Lake Stevens, okay? Now, law enforcement and the FBI investigated the case, but after 45 days, they closed the case. It took them 44 days to find him, first of all, okay? So to look for somebody, you know, why would it take so long to find somebody in Lake Stevens? It's not that big, okay? So the question arises that, you know, why was, you know, the law enforcement and the FBI so quick to shut the case down? Well, you know, had it been white, do you think there would have been more time spent on searching for him to find him quickly? And there also would have been more time to conduct the investigation. But the young man wasn't white. So similar, you know, the Muslim community, of course, is asking the FBI to open the investigation again, but they didn't get enough signatures in their petitions to get it opened. So, you know, who knows what happened to him? But the Snohomish County Examiner decided that it was not suicide. It was undetermined, but then, of course, the case is closed. So tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. And he spent, like I said, fine. He needs he needs no introduction, but tonight I have that honor of doing it. He's a recipient of the National Press Club Award for Distinguished Online Journalism in 2002 for a miniseries that he put together for MSNBC. He has spent over 50 years tracking and writing about white supremacy groups here, and spent a lot of that time actually in the Northwest. So he is the man of the hour. He is the man that is widely renowned in our country as the leading expert on white supremacy. He has written like 10 books, okay? And the last book he wrote was The Age of Insurrection, The Radicals' Right, Assault on American Democracy. So we have a lot to be concerned with. So please welcome our keynote speaker, David Neiwert.
Lovely turnout tonight. Thank you, Juan, and thank you to Unidos and to, as well as my fellow speakers here. It was great hearing your presentation. And we'll give a talk. I mean, when they first approached me about this, I was originally just going to do a sort of history of the radical right in the Northwest and in the West, but they proposed this topic of white Christian nationalism versus cultural diversity, which I thought was pretty intriguing because pretty early on in my blogging career, back in 2003 or 4, one of the topics that I frequently brought up was I was constantly defending multiculturalism, particularly against critics. And the thing that I always like to point out is that you really only have two choices. You have white supremacy or you have multiculturalism. There isn't another choice. Partly because, as you'll see, multiculturalism arose as a response to white supremacy, which was in fact the dominant worldview, particularly in the United States, 100 years ago. It was considered commonplace, conventional, mainstream thought. We'll go through that. And interestingly, the Northwest plays a key role in all this, as well as the development, as we saw, as we'll see, of white supremacy as both as a mainstream phenomenon as well as a fringe phenomenon after World War II. So, let's get started here. So, white supremacy really kind of arose originally, at least it was reflected in academia by what we call evolutionary anthropology, which is one of the earliest forms of anthropology. The basic idea of evolutionary anthropology is that every human society, that there's actually a hierarchy of human societies that begin with lower, supposedly primitive societies, and then work their way up to what evolutionary anthropologists considered the apex of evolution of human culture, which was white patriarchy. That was at the very top. And, there was, you could find different anthropological approaches, but this is basically the ruling view of academia through the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it seeped into seeped into our culture and became actually predominant it was expressed in ways such as the whole pseudoscience of eugenics, or which is also known as race hygiene, which basically was obsessed with developing pure racial bloodlines so that white people only mated with other white people, and it's anyway, it had its own set of hierarchies. As it happened, and it became really so commonplace that there were national bestsellers about this, including this one, The Rising Tide of Color. Lothrop Stoddard's book went through multiple printings, was #1 on the bestseller list for quite a few years, or for several years, and sold millions of copies. As you can see, the subtitle is The Threat Against White Supremacy. Stoddard was a Harvard professor. Then there was also The Passing of the Great Race, Madison Grant. He was a friend of Woodrow Wilson's, another, I think he was at Yale, professor, and they argued the same thing, which is basically that white supremacy was being threatened by the arrival of non-white immigrants. And they were especially focused, as it happened, on Asian immigration at the time, which was, in fact, a major topic here on the West Coast. They were countered by this man, a gentleman named Franz Boas. He was a German-born Jew who was a professor at Columbia. He's also considered the father of modern anthropology, as well as the father of multiculturalism. Boas actually got his start in the Pacific Northwest, studying the Northwest American coastal native tribes. In particular, he spent a lot of time up in the northern Vancouver Island area with the Kwakwaka'wakw tribe out of Alert Bay. And he studied them very carefully for quite a few years. And at one point, Boas has kind of a mixed record in looking back. Now he organized a group of about 40 villagers from Alert Bay to go out to Chicago for the 1892 World Fair or World Exposition, and basically show people what a Northwest tribal village looked like. And this photo was taken from one of the participants, the man with the killer whale transformation mask. But the important thing was that what Boas discovered was, or what Boas found from his studies, was information that clearly undercut the evolutionary anthropology thesis, in particularly the hierarchies. And of course, one of the standards of this was that not only were the less developed peoples, as they considered them, lower on the hierarchical scale. One of the things that symbolized the forward evolution was the dominance of a patriarchal culture, and that the thesis was that cultures all naturally will evolve always from matriarchy into patriarchy. And Boas, in examining the Kwakwaka'wakw people in particular, found that there were many tribes that were in fact not only led by women that were matriarchal, but they had evolved to that form from previously patriarchal structures. And he started developing this thesis that basically argued against the whole idea of this hierarchy of cultures, and instead argued that that basically cultural information, your cultural environment, is what informs your character as a people, and that these are not things that basically cultural superiority the superiority of one culture over another was an illusion. And he, of course, later, as he explored all of this thesis, which we now know as multiculturalism, he also contemplated its effects on democracy, because basically, as he argued in this book, white supremacy is toxic to and counter to the principles of democracy itself. And I think one of the quotes here, this quote here from Boas is basically sums up, you know, the conclusion of his book. And at the time, this was actually a controversial statement. The behavior of an individual is determined not by his racial affiliation, but by the character of his ancestry and his cultural environment. This is considered common sense now, but in 1936, when he wrote that, it was not. And the issue of white supremacy was always a big issue, was always was a constant topic of discussion for all kinds of political and other cultural discussions and part of the discourse, especially prior to World War II. This, for instance, this is a headline from the Seattle Star in 1919 as part of their ongoing campaign against Japanese immigration to the West Coast. And, you know, asking, is this to remain a white man's land? Well, this is what the eugenicists were obsessed with, was this idea that, oh, white culture will get overwhelmed by this influx of brown people. And here in the Northwest, we also were, this expressed itself in a number of ways. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was actually a formidable presence here in the Northwest. They ran the state of Oregon. This is a group gathering of over 1,000 people out in Issaquah in 1922. And the Klan was also considered very mainstream. Here's the 4th of July float for the Ku Klux Klan up in Ferndale. Washington State was one of the only states that actually put this man on the presidential ballot in 1936. His name is William Dudley Pelley, and he ran an organization called the Silver Shirts. The Silver Shirts more or less succeeded the Klan in the 30s as the go-to place for white supremacists. The Klan fell apart in the late 20s because it was run by a bunch of scam artists, and it ran into all of these organizations ran into serious financial trouble and had to close shop. So, but in the early 30s, Pelley started promoting the Silver Shirts, and they were a big thing out here. He was actually very popular in Washington State. There was a big Silver Shirt march in downtown Seattle. And in addition to holding mass marches, they would recruit people in their homes. So this is a shot from a Life magazine spread on how the Silver Shirts were recruiting people in their homes. Now, these attitudes really shifted dramatically as a result of World War II once we got a look at what white supremacy actually wrought, and particularly in the Holocaust, and once the smoke cleared from the concentration camps and we saw what had happened. The world reeled at that, and in the decades that ensued, white supremacy as a worldview fell on extremely hard times. It was pushed to the fringe. It was believed to be an evil and monstrous worldview. But it continued to exist still on the fringes. And in particular, there was a religion that called Christian Identity, or I should say a religious movement called Christian Identity. It was devised by a pastor named Wesley Swift, who helped set up churches all around the country that practiced this argument. And basically their belief was that white people were the true children of Israel, that Jews were actually the literal offspring of Satan, and that all non-whites were soulless mud people, subhumans whose existence did not matter. And this belief system continued festering on the fringes for another 20, 30 years. In particular, one of the largest groups was one down in Southern California they called themselves the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, and that was actually Swift's congregation, but it was a major center for it. When Swift died, he passed along his congregation to a gentleman named Richard Butler, who promptly who in short order moved the whole operation from Southern California to the Idaho Panhandle in Hayden Lake. And they called it the Aryan Nations. Here's a shot of Butler fairly early in his career in northern Idaho. And the Aryan Nations held these annual gatherings they called the Aryan Congress, and they would, they gathered white supremacists, mostly Ku Klux Klansmen from the South, and continuing Christian identity believers from the Southwest up to Idaho once a year, where they would light crosses and do their racist thing. Now, as it happened, this is about the time I started doing all this. At that time, I was the 21-year-old editor of the Sandpoint Daily Bee in Sandpoint, Idaho. And just very much starting out my career. And we sat down with our publisher, and we considered these guys a real conundrum. This is in 1979, and just a couple of years after they had moved into the region, and we were contemplating, how do we handle this? How do we deal with all this? And we made what we thought was the astute decision not to cover them, because we figured, well, our thinking was that, these guys just want attention, they just want publicity, and we're not going to give it to them. We'll deprive them of oxygen, and they'll just die, and go away. Well, that didn't work out so well. Not only did they continue gathering people to the Northwest, other skinheads and other haters, they also started really recruiting within the mainstream. This guy here is kind of like your typical stereotype of what we would think of as a neo-Nazi skinhead or a neo-Nazi Aryan Nations member, but the reality is most of them were, in fact, just kind of dweebish LARPers who wanted to wear uniforms and weren't terribly capable. And not only that, the other reality was, especially that I discovered when I would sit down and start talking to people at these gatherings, is that the vast majority of them, aren't skinheads wearing black leather and swastika tattoos. The vast majority of them are just ordinary-looking people who could pass for your neighbors. And realizing that neo-Nazis don't come with horns sprouting on their heads, They are actually people who are very much among us, and they hold views that, they think of as just conservative, right? But one of the realities, of course, that I have come to know about right-wing extremists over the years is that they all see themselves as heroes. They all see themselves as heroic defenders of the white race or of, the American Republic in some cases. But over the years, Butler continued to attract people to the Northwest. They continued to have these rallies. One of the things that they started doing was, I'm wondering, okay. Basically, but the core of everything that they argued was fundamentally anti-government. They were against the federal government in every way they could, and of course, for the skinhead types, this meant, taking a boot to Uncle Sam, but for others, it meant, it was expressed in movements like the Posse Comitatus. Posse Comitatus was an early form of right-wing extremism that adopted mostly Christian identity beliefs as its core, but decided it was directed in a political direction. And chief among their politics was the idea of, what they really were on about was trying to stop the federal government from enforcing civil rights laws. This is in the 1960s that these ideas were developed, and in the 1970s they began spreading in the Pacific Northwest. Sort of key to this anti-federalism came a lot of arguments that they claim came from the Constitution, and they began calling themselves constitutionalists, claiming that their interpretation of the Constitution was the only one that really mattered. And among the tenets of their beliefs, this radical localism was, the idea that the federal government not only couldn't enforce civil rights laws, it had no business being involved in anything other than national defense. It couldn't own public lands. It couldn't involve itself in education on a national scale. It could not pass and enforce environmental laws. These are real fundamental to the Posse Comitatus, as well as what evolved from it. Now, the Posse Comitatus was an explicitly anti-Semitic, extremely racist organization, and their writings, particularly a book called The Blue Book, really expressed a lot of these really bigoted beliefs. And they inspired radicalism. There was a gentleman named Gordon Call who went on a rampage in North Dakota. He shot and killed 2 law enforcement officers there, then fled to Arkansas, where he was finally captured, or not captured. He was cornered by a sheriff down in Arkansas, who he then shot. But anyway, Call wound up dying in that shootout, and he became a martyr figure for the radical right. Now, part of what was going on in the radical right in the 1970s was this idea that we needed to have a sort of national division. And the idea was to turn the Pacific Northwest into the great white homeland. They even came up with a map, which you can see here, of how to divide the country up into racial quadrants. And they believed that the only way they would get there was through terroristic violence. There was a book that was extremely popular on the radical right and passed all around the Aryan nations called the Turner Diaries. It was a blueprint for waging this so-called race war. One of the big fans of this book was a guy named Robert Matthews, who lived up in Medellin Falls. He had moved there from Arizona. This is where he grew up. And he lived in that northeast corner of the state, partly because it was a very short drive for him to go down to Hayden Lake and participate in Church of Jesus Christ Christian ceremonies. Matthews came up with the idea of following the Turner Diaries blueprint, and he organized a gang of about 20 men, mostly recruited from the Aryan nations, who then embarked on a rampage in 1984 in which they robbed some 24 banks, as well as an armored car in Ukiah, California, from which they took several $1 million, which remains to this day the largest take ever in an overland stage robbery. They also assassinated a radio talk show host in Denver named Alan Berg because he had had the audacity to criticize some of these white supremacist leaders on the air. Matthews is finally cornered. The FBI went to work and quickly ran these guys to ground. And in December, Matthews himself was cornered up here on Whidbey Island. And he refused to come out, and they lobbed a flare into the house, and it burned down around him. Nonetheless, and now every year on the anniversary of that death, you'll see groups of skinheads gathering out there at Whidbey Island, and they hold events around the Northwest to commemorate Matthews' death. They called that date, which is, I believe, December 7th, Martyrs' Day. One of the other things that happened, of course, one of that Matthews did was, in stealing all this money, he handed out large sums of it to leaders of white supremacist groups all around the country. And so the FBI then went to work and collected, basically tried to get some of that money back, but mostly they prosecuted a group of, I believe, 16 white supremacists who had prominent standing in the movement in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And this was in 1986, and including this man. I'm brain cramping. Who later turned up here. Yeah, this guy was. I'm sorry, I have blanked on this guy's name. He was a major leader of the Klan in terms of he led the Klan's attempts to try to keep Vietnamese immigrants out from Texas in the 80s, and after he, of course, as you'll see, they all were acquitted. The government attempted a fairly novel sort of approach, which was that they used the Ku Klux Klan Act to try to prosecute these guys. And it went about as well as you might expect for a trial in Arkansas. And as a result, these white supremacists were all acquitted. But one of the things that happened was, now you see this guy in this photo. His name is Louis Beam, and he was a major figure at the Aryan Nations and was a regular speaker at the Aryan Congresses. and Beam was one of the guys who was acquitted in that trial. And afterwards, he came up with, he and his fellow racists started working on ideas on how to avoid having this kind of trouble again. And they came up with a plan, a concept they called leaderless resistance. And the idea of leaderless resistance was to basically form cells, diffuse cells and people that would separate people who would carry out terroristic or criminal actions on behalf of the movement from the leaders of the movement, so that the leaders of the movement could continue organizing and doing their thing without having to worry about whether their followers were out there committing bank robberies and assassinating radio talk show hosts. So this was the origin of the militia concept. Basically, there were two aspects of leaderless resistance. One was what they call the lone wolf strategy, and so when you hear them talk about lone wolf in the media, that this mass killer was just a lone wolf, it reflects that this was a discrete strategy of the white supremacist movement to have men who had no actual organizational connections to the movements that they were acting out on behalf of, and rather would go out and commit mass murders and terrorism on behalf of the movement without having to drag the movement's leaders down. And then, of course, the other aspect of it was to form these militia cells who could do more or less the same thing, or were capable of standing up and engaging in actual anti-government action, and to form a paramilitary response. And so we started seeing militias organizing in the early 1990s here in the Pacific Northwest and in Idaho and Montana in particular, but we also saw them out here in Western Washington. One of the progenitors of this was a gentleman named John Trockman, who lived in Knoxon, Montana. This is actually a photo I took of him in Mount Vernon. Trockman would travel all around, not just the Northwest, but the whole regional West, and hold these, give these talks on how explaining that the government was planning to use black helicopters to round up conservatives and take them to put them in concentration camps, FEMA concentration camps. Now, of course, you may have heard of FEMA concentration camps. Well, that's the conspiracy theory is still around. Alex Jones still trots it out every now and then, but it actually had its origins with the militia of Montana. The militia movement, though, suffered a big setback in 1995 when one of its followers, a man named Timothy McVeigh, set off a truck bomb in front of the Federal Building as revenge for the Waco disaster of 2 years before, and killed 168 people and badly injured 500 or so more. This was not a good PR move for the Patriot movement. And this is one of the things that is important to understand. These folks called themselves the Patriot movement from the start, and they still call themselves that. The Patriot movement is the militia movement and vice versa. We also saw it spreading in places like Montana. This is a sign from the Montana Freeman Ranch outside of Jordan, Montana. Actually, I think this was, right, that was Jordan. And they engaged in an 81-day standoff, armed standoff, still the record for the longest armed standoff in 1996. And fortunately, that ended with no one dying. The FBI waited them out, And at the end of the day, they were able to talk everybody in the compound, inside the compound, into coming out. They were hoping for another mass martyrdom event, and the law enforcement decided to outsmart them. So, but there were a lot of other figures operating here in the Northwest as well. This gentleman, his name is Colonel James Bo Wrights. He's considered in many regards the model for Rambo because he actually led a group of veterans back to Vietnam after the fall of Saigon to try to recover the POWs who were supposed to be still being held in the jungle in Vietnam. There were none. He came back and empty-handed, but he had a new conspiracy theory that there was actually the CIA had hidden the prisoners from him. Anyway, these conspiracy theories continued to spread. There's, including here in Snohomish County, this was a sign from a group called Freedom County. They were associated with the Patriot movement. This guy, I'm trying to remember if this was the town of Snohomish. I think it was near there. The Freedom County folks were basically doing the posse comitatus or constitutionalist arguments, claiming that the county and the state had no jurisdiction over them, had no ability to collect taxes, and they also they were quite fond of threatening law enforcement officers. Sheriff Rick Bart had to deal with these guys quite a bit back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, back to Hayden Lake. Richard Butler got to old age in 1999, but in 2000 he lost the Aryan Nations compound as a result of a lawsuit brought by an indigenous woman and her son who were attacked when they accidentally wandered onto the Aryan Nations property. And the Southern Poverty Law Center basically took the lawsuit and put Richard Butler out of business. Within a few weeks after getting the property, they burned down the old church, and it's now I believe it's a center for community appraisal. But these guys didn't go away. We saw this group of Nazis, for instance, on the steps of the state capitol in 2006. They were actually organized out of Portland, but they included a lot of members from Western Washington as well. The interesting thing about this particular gathering was that the counter-protesters who turned out took a really ingenious approach in that they all dressed up in clown outfits and sat and made fun of these guys all day, mooned them, and laughed and made jokes, and it was actually really good. I mean, even the cops had fun, and these guys are just red-faced, furious, just livid. They were totally humiliated. And within about a year, the organization that put this show on was, in fact, out of business. So, and I haven't ever heard from this guy, the guy who organized them again originally. And he was actually, back in the 90s, he had been a radio talk show host here in Snohomish County. Nonetheless, the militia concept was really what they considered, continued promoting and continued leaning on. They saw it as a way to resist federal tyranny. Now, come about 2000, one thing that happened was that the Patriot movement and the conspiracy theorists really latched onto the Y2K scare in 1999, and they got a lot of people to basically store a bunch of beans and rice in their basements and waters. It basically convinced a lot of people to get ready for the end of the world as we knew it because of the Y2K bug that was going to wipe out all of our computer systems and send the world into chaos. And of course, as you may recall, there was when Y2K came and went and the computers did not break down, the very robust response within the computing community really foreclosed any of these paranoid fears. There were a lot of people with beans and rice on their hands and a lot of patriots with egg on their face. So the movement went into a serious downturn, but not for long. Instead, what we saw them starting to organize around was the issue of immigration. In fact, they started forming militias that would patrol the borders down, particularly in Arizona and California, to try to prevent immigrants from coming over. And you may notice that they also believed in building a border wall. The leader of this was a guy named Chris Simcox, or at least one of the leaders. He organized an outfit down in Arizona called the Minutemen, and in 2005, you may recall, they had a big they had a big powwow down on Border Watch. It was supposed to last a month, and it only barely lasted a week and a half. And really by the end of it, the two guys, Simcox and his partner, basically just realized they both hated each other's guts and divided the organization in two. And that was, but that was really only the beginning. This was, of course, the scene at their 2005 gathering. Mostly a lot of people sitting in their chairs on the border, and as it happened, they didn't really see any border crossers or immigrants, but they sure saw a lot of TV guys. In fact, the press outnumbered participants in that 2005 event. But the press would ask Chris Simcox, well, why are you doing this on the Mexican border? Aren't there people crossing illegally from Canada also? And he'd say, yeah, there are, and we're going to have border watches up on the Canadian border next year, you'll see. Because otherwise, he was basically trying to say, oh, we're not racist, we do it on the Canadian border too. So sure enough, up here in, this is a photo I took up at their launch. They had a place outside of Blaine, set up a property outside of Blaine that became their kind of reconnaissance central for doing border watches on the Canadian border. And as you can see, it was really rugged duty. And yeah, Simcox actually came up from Arizona to help promote the Blaine border watchers and do their thing. Now, as it happened, this is also the first time when I was covering this gathering that Simcox met at, the first time that I met this woman, Shauna Ford. She was the press secretary for the Minutemen at the time. Shauna was a former, actually she's a former teen prostitute and a felon with a rap sheet as long as her leg, but she later sort of reformed her image. She worked on the line at Boeing and then left that job to become a hairdresser. And then, after having married John Ford, Juan's friend, decided that she was actually going to save. She drove did these long drives down to California and listened to talk radio all the time. And she got convinced that she needed to save America from immigration. So she went down to, she got sideways with the Minutemen here. She got caught rifling through the personal belongings of the Minuteman leader at his trailer home there next to their center up in Plain, and constantly lied. She is a psychopathic liar, and nobody trusted her for very long if they got to know Shauna, but so she kept jumping from position to position. She wound up getting hooked up. She was close to Simcox for a while, and then wound up getting connected with his former partner, who set her up with an operation down on the border. She set up her own group, called it Minuteman American Defense, and liked to give interviews to visiting filmmakers and documentarians and news people to show them how they were trying to save the country from these border crossers. But Shauna also had this idea that she really, they didn't have a whole lot of money going around, and she wanted to set up a militia compound. She wanted to buy a piece of property down there in Arizona. And and of course, she didn't really have any money at all. So actually, her first plan was to have her husband, John, shot. But because if John died intestate, she stood to inherit $500,000 or so that he was worth. And this was going to solve all of her problems. John inconveniently survived. He was in a coma for 3 months, so this is part of why the police didn't properly investigate the case. But they wound up, so she wound up going to Plan B, and her Plan B was to rip off marijuana smugglers on the border, rip off drug smugglers, go into their drug houses and take their money and their drugs and use the profits to finance their operation. Well, she did this in May 2009. She decided, she actually tried to act out this plan. She went to the home of a guy who was an actual smuggler, but it was his home, and where his wife and his 9-year-old daughter were with him, down in Aravaca. This is a photo of Brasenia that hangs in the school that she attended. They shot all 3 of them. However, the mother, Gina Gonzalez, only pretended to be dead. And then when they left the house, she got up, called the police, and as she was on the phone, Shauna came back in the room, back in the door to collect the AK-47 that one of their members had left sitting on the stove, and she saw Gina on the phone with her dead daughter in her arms, and ran back outside, said, "You guys need to get in there and finish the job." So the gentleman named Bush, who she met, he was also from Washington State, and he sent him back in. He tried to, as it happened, Gina's husband had left a gun sitting out on the counter. She grabbed it, huddled in a corner of the kitchen, and when Bush came in to try to finish the job, she didn't know how to shoot a gun, but she was just like, blam, 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 like this, but she got lucky and nicked him in the calf, but took a good chunk of flesh out of him, and he went running out the door, and they all fled. And of course, along the way, he left a lovely trail of DNA for the police to find the next morning. And since he had been in prison before, it didn't take them long to identify these guys and figure out who they were. So they were all arrested within about 2 weeks. I did cover the trials. It was not a happy time. It was a very difficult case to cover. But Sean was on death row, so is Mr. Bush, and the third participant is in prison with life with no parole. Nonetheless, the Minutemen continued doing their thing. One of the things they tried to do, that Chris Simcox tried to organize, was a border wall. And you can see here about how well it went. But they got millions of dollars. They raked in millions of dollars on this national campaign to build a border wall because it was wildly popular. And of course, this is really about all the further they got with it. Was putting up a few steel posts. I did a whole investigative story on it back in 2009, and we found that their whole fence building scam was a scam. But that didn't stop them. They kept organizing on the border, and these. Of course, in 2009, at that point, we also had this thing, something happened called a black president, which is when the militia movement turned from doing border vigilante stuff to just becoming a full-fledged militia movement. In fact, we started seeing the militia numbers in the country rise dramatically with Barack Obama's election from, I think, 131, we had 131 militia groups in the country in 2007, and by 2011 we had something like 1,100 of them. The numbers shifted dramatically, and so did the numbers of people who were participating in these militia groups. Now, you may notice they all love to wave this flag, the yellow Gadsden flag, which was one of the, one of the things that was actually really popular with the militia movement in the 90s. And this was actually one of the ways I knew when I started covering the Minutemen in 2005 that they were definitely connected to the Patriot movement, because they were just picking up the same motifs, same conspiracy theories, and same sort of underlying eliminationist attitude towards non-white people. And we even, I went to a Tea Party gathering in Montana, where they not only had the Gadsden flag, but also were selling copies of Mein Kampf. Of course, this is supposed to educate us on what the enemy looked like, but honestly, it was a gathering that made it very clear to me that the Tea Party had become a major conduit for Patriot movement extremism to move into the mainstream of American society. And that's very much exactly what happened over the ensuing 5 years. One of the keys to this is a guy named Stuart Rhodes, who set up an organization called the Oath Keepers in 2009. And they were actually major players in the Tea Party movement between 2010 and 14. And their whole shtick was to try to recruit law enforcement officers as well as military veterans into the ranks of this basically conspiracist worldview that was what they believed. Another major figure in all this was this guy. His name is Richard Mack. I first saw Richard Mack actually in 1994 in Bellevue giving a speech about militias, using militias as a way to organize against the government's nefarious plans to take away all your guns. Richard Mack was, he was an Arizona sheriff, and he became really famous in the early 90s for having stood up to the attempts to regulate assault weapons. And he became a hero in the NRA, and he translated this celebrity into basically promoting posse comitatus ideas, arguing that, among other things, the sheriff is the supreme law of the county, the supreme law of the land, and he's able to overcome and can overrule the ability of federal law enforcement or even state law enforcement within their jurisdiction. And of course, this is our nonsense. And all you have to do is actually read the Constitution, because there are several clauses in the Constitution that make quite clear that no, actually federal power is supreme in matters of law. Anyway, Mac organized an outfit called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, CSPOA, and it began in 2009. It was modeled after an organization that a friend of his, a guy named Jack McLam, did back in the 90s that was also aimed at recruiting law enforcement officers. Anyway, I actually got this photo of Mac in Olympia. He showed up to protest Washington State's passage of its gun control laws back in, I think, 2014. And he was, of course, because he was a Patriot Movement guy, he was also we saw a lot of militia types showing up for these events as well, because they all believe the same thing. Now, along about the same time in 2014, we saw actually an attempt at a real direct confrontation between patriots and law enforcement down in Nevada as a result of this man. His name is Cliven Bundy, and he was a rancher who hadn't paid his range fees for 20 years and owed the government millions. And they decided to foreclose on his cattle and tried to take them away, but they wound up having a big armed standoff down there in Bundyville instead. And we had guys aiming sniper rifles at law enforcement officers. And of course, Stuart Rhodes should show up at Stuart Rhodes, because he was very much part of the scene, as well as Richard Mack. Mack actually, in this interview with Fox News, said, what we really want to do is have the women and children in the front, so that when they start shooting, America can see that it's women and children who are dying. And it's like, yeah, brave guys, 2 years later, now, as you know, the Bundyville standoff really kind of fizzled out after about 3 weeks, especially towards the end of the 3 weeks. They were all pointing guns at each other because they couldn't get along at all. Some of the militiamen drew guns on some of the Oath Keepers and vice versa, and there was almost gunfire at the scene. And so they all decided to just break it up. And so for the next 2 years, Oath Keepers and the Patriots kept looking for another Bundyville type situation. They first tried to create a standoff down in Grants Pass, Oregon, a place called the Sugar Pine Mine. That fizzled out because there wasn't actually a dispute to be had. And they tried another one in Lincoln, Montana, that similarly fizzled out. But in 2016, January 2016, Bundy's son, Ammon Bundy, and a group of fellow patriots took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge down in South Central Oregon, and held it for about 3 weeks. The man that you see there on the left, Lavoy Finnegan, was killed in a standoff. There was basically they were trying to drive from the Malheur to another town to try to recruit the sheriff at this other town to come help them out. And en route, the state patrol pulled them over, and it wound up getting into an armed shootout. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I get the horrible task because we only have the building until a certain amount of time. And we have one question we have to get to, or a couple questions.
Okay.
That I have to stop you.
Oh, okay.
So don't hit
Yeah,
me.
I know. Well, see, I didn't test this,
No,
this
it's
talk
not. I
out.
would love to spend like another hour just listening to this great.
Can I, I'm going to show two things here. So just real quickly, this continued on through, and of course we saw it all starting to rise up with Donald Trump, who had all kinds of connections to the radical right. On his inauguration night, I was at Red Square at UW, and there was a big confrontation there between anti-fascists and the Milo Yiannopoulos fans who were there. This gentleman, who I was standing next to for about 5 minutes before all this happened, about 45 seconds after I took the shot, was in fact shot by one of the alt-righters. And I was a prosecution witness at the trial of the couple that shot him. But that was when we started seeing these street demonstrations from groups who called themselves Patriot Prayer, the Proud Boys, American Guard, and the Rise Above movement. They were smattered with neo-Nazis and white nationalists. We saw a lot of street violence. And this eventually led to August of 2017, the Charlottesville disaster. I'll show you. Oh yeah, and we also started seeing, and these are some of the Proud Boys. You may recognize this man in the center. And this was a neo-Nazi group that was at UW. And the main thing about the Proud Boys is that they were all about bringing the violence. And that is what I just wanted to show you this video so you get a sample of what I was experiencing. I covered about 18 of these events. This is a sample of what we were experiencing. If I can.
Holy fuck! Hey, that's enough! That's enough! That's enough! Hey, that's enough! Hey!
Then I have one more video that I'd like to show here. So I'll let you guys see all my slides, Proud Boys. This is Ethan Nordine. Nordine is quite notorious now because he's serving 18 years in prison for having led the January 6th insurrection. This is some of the action we saw here in Snohomish County, in the town of Snohomish, when the rumors were spreading that Antifa was going to come and invade the town. That wasn't just there, it also happened all around the country, as well as in Coeur d'Alene. And then later, a couple of years later, when we had fires on the West Coast, we had them, there were rumors of Antifa starting the wildfires. And so we had armed groups of men showing up in rural areas, armed and ready to go after those Antifa when they showed up to start wildfires. They got involved in the pandemic after 2020. This is the leader of the Washington State 3%ers. And then it all started culminating, especially in 2020 with the election and then the election loss of Donald Trump, which is when we saw them go into full violent mode. This is the same guy who was in that picture from Snohomish. On YouTube, he said, "Let's just invade the Capitol." And as a maid said, "You shut up, don't say that," because they didn't want to let the secret out. Yeah, he's. And then here's Ethan leading the. Ethan is a Proud Boy from Auburn, and I saw him at probably a dozen of these Proud Boys events. Anyways, let's just kind of cut to the chase here so we don't, we also are having attacks on the LGBTQ community in places like Coeur d'Alene, where we had a group of neo-fascist Patriot Fronters show up. And then we also had continuing activity from the constitutional sheriffs. A constitutional sheriff's a CSPOA figure named Lauren Culp was actually the Republican nominee for governor in the 2020 election. We have also finally, as you may recall, in the last election, we started seeing a lot of people organizing to try to prevent to actually monitor the polls and threaten and intimidate people at the polls. One of the groups that did this election denialism is called True the Vote. And they actually, this picture shows them at an event they did with the CSPOA in Las Vegas last year. And they also joined forces with this man, Sheriff Mark Lamb from Pinal County, Arizona, who I guess folks here in Snohomish County may know a little bit about. And yeah, they tried to do intimidation of the polls here in Western Washington. They didn't succeed, but they are organizing again, and they plan to not give up. And if you want an example of that.
Are we at war? Yeah. No, I want to hear it. Are we at war? Yeah. Are you prepared to take this to its ultimate conclusion and destroy the deep state? Yeah. Root and branch? Yeah. Do you understand what a historic week this is? You know why it's a historic week? Because of you. And you and you. This is what they fear. They fear not just a electorate that is informed, but an electorate that says, no longer are we just going to sit there and take it. You are an awakened army. You know why this is a historic week? Because of this conference and what it's putting together. From this day forward, there's no more talk. It's just action, action, action. Yeah. All these traitors must go to prison. All traitors must go to prison. All traitors must go to prison. Are you a cadre now? Are you a vanguard? Are you a tip of a new revolutionary generation that is going to save this country? Are you sure about that? Is your task and purpose every day to take your country back? Are there any days off? God bless you. There's no substitute for victory.
So, for people who think that we don't need to take them seriously, I just think we should listen to what they're saying, and I think it's probably wise to believe them. So, I've got a question here. If these groups were to succeed in toppling the federal government, how do they propose that communities would continue? No Social Security, disaster funds, no fire department, et cetera. I think their whole purpose is to create as much chaos as possible. This is about authoritarianism. This is about attempting to displace American democracy with authoritarian rule. They want to have what they call a Christian nationalist rule, and I don't think that they have given any thought to what would happen on a local level. They just think it will continue to happen, and I don't think that there is. This isn't on their radar. What they're concerned, what they really want to do, is create as much chaos as possible, so that people don't believe that their democratic institutions can protect them and keep them safe anymore, and that people will get frustrated and reach for an authoritarian strongman who will promise them safety and security. And that's how authoritarians always win when we see democracies fail. I know we don't think American democracy can fail, but democracies do fail all the time. And democracies also don't just defend themselves, they must be defended. So I think the key is for Americans to recognize this is happening, to understand that it's happening, to wake up and do something about it. Because ultimately, I think we massively outnumber them, but we're just kind of sleepwalking through this. And I don't think we can afford to sleepwalk any longer.
It's so sobering to hear that, but it's, we all need like a reality check. And I'm really apologize again for having to cut such a wonderful presentation short. It's just when you rent a space, there's a certain point where they just unplug everything and lock the door. So we wanted to make sure that we could just get the closing comments, and then our speaker, David Neiwert, might be available for a little bit of time to talk afterwards. I'm not sure. I'm not going to hold you to that necessarily. And then also, please contact us for a copy of the tape, the slides, the things that we weren't able to get into tonight. But I wanted to welcome to the stage, just for brief closing remarks, Juan Peralez, and we will have Snohomish County Councilmember Meagan Dunn and Representative Bill Ramos. Could you all come to the stage if you're not already here? I know you are, Juan. You want to start with the closing comments, please.
Just really briefly, I just wanted to say that tonight was a first step, right? So we need to combat misinformation. We need to know more, to educate ourselves. And so I think of tonight as just one step towards that journey. We definitely need better state and county collaboration for sharing information to prevent, deter, and confront domestic violent extremism. And I look forward to continuing that important work. I also think of what Michael said about a kaleidoscope, and a kaleidoscope only has 2 mirrors in it. So you get all those colors and you get all that variety, all that diversity, but it only takes 2 mirrors. And then if you're in a clown costume and you're by yourself, people are gonna look at you funny. But if you have your friends with you, then they'll take you seriously. So thank you all for coming.
All right, next up, we wanted to have Representative Bill Ramos from the 5th Legislative District. And I wanted to mention, in case you didn't forget, because I'm not going to read the whole bio of that, he was the prime sponsor of HB 1333, a bill that would establish a statewide commission to see how we can combat domestic extremism. Welcome.
Thank you. And the main point tonight is, I want to say, This extremism, white supremacy, has been with us forever. It will be with us forever. The point is it ebbs and flows to the amount that we allow it to take over. And right now it's rising. And the only way to put it down is to actively combat it. I started with the bill last year. I'm going to continue every year. We have to take action to drive it back into the hole that it came out of and lower it down. So do something, see something, say something. We must act and talk about it every day. Thank you very much.
And last but not least, Juan Peralez. And I want to mention again, Juan, for having been born in 1059, you look great.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight, and I hope they can go home with a better understanding of the dangers of white Christian nationalism that poses not only to your personal safety, but the threat to our democracy. And that, to me, is why we need to get engaged in addressing this issue and talk to your respective legislators that must address the issue in Olympia this coming session. So I want to thank you, Mr. David Neiwert, for being here tonight and giving us this education. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Please stay in touch. If you have any questions, we have people from our planning committee that could hopefully answer them all. And I want to thank our panelists and, of course, our keynote speaker, David Neiwert. Drive safe.